Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I could analyze the mental health and personality characteristics of Jimmy McGill, a fictional character in the television show Better Call Saul. This analysis is based on the first 4 seasons and a few episodes of season 5. This video does contain spoilers from this television series. Jimmy McGill is a fictional character played by an actor named Bob Odenkirk. I'll be analyzing and diagnosing this character and some of the other characters in the show, not the actors who are playing those characters. So first I'll go through a brief timeline that we see here in Better Call Saul, and then look at some of the mental health and personality characteristics of Jimmy McGill. So with the timeline, we see in the beginning of Better Call Saul, Jimmy McGill is a struggling attorney. He practices out of a room in the back of a nail salon, and he also lives there. We see he has a history of low-level criminal behavior, mostly fraud. Essentially, he functioned as a con artist for many years, relying on his superficial charm, acting, and elaborate stories to cheat people out of money. His behavior catches up with him, and he is arrested. His brother Chuck McGill, a well-respected attorney from New Mexico, gets Jimmy out of trouble, but he has to move to New Mexico and essentially be supervised by Chuck. Jimmy takes a job in the mailroom of the law firm that Chuck McGill founded, HHM. Also in the mailroom is a woman named Kim Wexler. She eventually becomes a love interest of Jimmy McGill. Kim Wexler is in law school and eventually becomes an attorney for HHM. Jimmy secretly goes to a diploma mill-style law school and eventually passes the bar and becomes an attorney himself. HHM, though, will not hire him. Only later does Jimmy figure out that it was his own brother, Chuck McGill, who did not want him working as an attorney. Now, Chuck McGill develops electromagnetic hypersensitivity. I've covered this in another video, and essentially stops working at HHM, although technically, of course, he still has a job there because he is a partner in the firm. Jimmy McGill takes care of Chuck for many years. Jimmy starts dealing with criminal elements, breaching ethics in order to provide services that they want. He also tries to build his career in legitimate ways, like working for a reputable law firm. Eventually, the conflict between Jimmy and his brother Chuck reaches a critical mass, and as a result of their efforts to destroy each other, Jimmy's license to practice law is suspended for 1 year, and Chuck McGill ends his own life. Jimmy rides out his suspension by taking odd jobs and engaging in criminal activity. But eventually he gets his law license back, and he sets his business name as Saul Goodman. So his name is still Jimmy McGill, but in his law practice he goes by Saul Goodman. He continues to build a brand of representing criminals by using unethical and unlawful tactics. I find the show Better Call Saul quite fascinating. I was a fan of Breaking Bad, and when I saw this prequel was coming out, I thought it was really unlikely that it was going to be as good as Breaking Bad, but I think it really is, in a different way. Breaking Bad was a show about how somebody could change, how they could go from being pro-social to antisocial. Walter White's descent into the dark triad traits, psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, was a key part of Breaking Bad. Better Call Saul is different. It's really about how people never change. Jimmy McGill starts out with Antisocial Personality Disorder, and despite every opportunity to change and a lot of motivation to grow and develop, he really stays the same. So essentially, Better Call Saul is the other side of the coin. Breaking Bad is about changing, and Better Call Saul is about remaining the same. Both shows are about how frustrating those realities are to others, right? To other people who are victimized or exposed to these behaviors. So now let's take a look at the mental health characteristics of Jimmy McGill. As I mentioned, I think it's pretty clear, to me anyway, that he has antisocial personality disorder. This is a cluster B personality disorder in the DSM. So this is the dramatic erratic cluster. It has 7 symptom criteria. So I will go through these symptom criteria and show where they align with Jimmy's behavior. So the first criterion, repeated unlawful behaviors. I think this is pretty clear. We see that Jimmy forges documents so that Chuck McGill would make a mistake with the Mesa Verde Bank legal filing. We see that Jimmy arranges to have this Hummel figure stolen from a local business, and he helps that burglar to escape the office. Now, the next criterion is consistent deceitfulness. I think this is extremely clear. He does this countless times. It's almost really natural to his character. The third symptom is impulsivity. We see that Jimmy erupted at his brother Chuck McGill about the recording when Chuck recorded him. And we see many other examples in the show where Jimmy just can't stop from acting on his thoughts and desires, right? He's just impulsive. Symptom number 4 is aggressiveness, getting into a lot of physical fights. Now, other than the eruption that I talked about before with the previous symptom criterion, this one is really missing. We really don't see much aggression on the part of Jimmy McGill. Some anger, but I don't think it really rises to meet this particular symptom criterion. Symptom number 5 is a reckless disregard for one's own safety and the safety of others. We see that Jimmy pulled this stunt with the billboard when he climbed up to rescue the guy, who of course was really in on the scam with him, and some other examples where he's really not looking out for the welfare of himself or others diligently. This one, for the most part, though, I think is a little murky. I think one could make the case that he meets this symptom, but one could also make the case that he's really not reckless in this way. So this one's a bit of a question mark. Symptom number 6 is consistent irresponsibility. I think this one is fairly clear. And the last symptom is a lack of remorse. So we see that Jimmy really takes joy in tricking the licensing board into lifting his suspension, right? That's an element where he lacks remorse for what he did. He never really felt badly about his criminal behavior that put him in that place to start with. And of course, we see many other examples where he's really not concerned about the feelings of others, specifically those who have been hurt by his own bad acts. So here we see he meets 5 and maybe 6 of the 7 symptom criteria. Only 3 are required for the diagnosis. Now, antisocial personality disorder also has a provision where it cannot be diagnosed in someone unless that person had conduct disorder symptoms before the age of 15. Now, through some of the flashbacks we see in Better Call Saul, it would appear that Jimmy McGill would qualify for this, like when he took money from the cash register when he was working in his father's store. Now, his age isn't specified. I don't recall them indicating exactly how old he was, but it does seem like it's not really a stretch to say that Jimmy McGill had conduct disorder symptoms when he was younger. Now let's take a look at some of the key themes and patterns we see with this character in the show. One of the things I really like about the Jimmy McGill character is the expression of antisocial personality disorder that's manifested. Often when it comes to this disorder, we see these TV shows and movies that show an individual suffering from this disorder as a serial killer or a master criminal or a violent supervillain, when in actuality, engaging in a lot of low-level con artist type fraud is much more typical of this disorder. Jimmy really doesn't have a violence component that we sometimes do see with antisocial personality disorder, and he carefully plans out his schemes. Because of these factors, he's able to work his way into legal practice, albeit with a disciplinary history that he obtains eventually, that 1-year suspension. But still, considering his propensity to commit crime, it's amazing he can actually hold on to his status as an attorney. This is really one of the elements that frustrates his brother, Chuck McGill. Chuck knows that Jimmy should not be an attorney. He knows Jimmy's real nature. He can see through the acting, and yet people won't always listen to Chuck because Chuck has his own mental health difficulties. So he's not able to convince others how unethical and dangerous Jimmy is. When Chuck finally gets an audience to pay attention to him, when people start to believe him, his pursuit of Jimmy ends up costing him his own job, and this leads to his self-destruction. So Jimmy McGill is, for the most part, able to escape the scrutiny and pursuit of Chuck McGill. Another part of the show I like is how Jimmy keeps bouncing back to the antisocial behavior. I've seen this many times in clinical practice. It's like there's a rubber band wrapped around him, and whenever he walks towards something pro-social, a tension builds, and eventually he just snaps right back to that antisocial attitude. This is really quite realistic. I'm sure many people have watched the show and looked at this character with frustration. He has so many opportunities to turn things around, and yet he keeps taking chances and moving in the wrong direction. It's like he's his own worst enemy. For example, we see in that whole mess with Chuck McGill, Jimmy was charged criminally, and the charges would be dropped after 1 year if he stayed out of trouble, and yet he continues to engage in criminal activity during that time. like orchestrating that theft of the Hummel figure I talked about before. Although, of course, in the show he makes it all the way through and the charges are dropped. So he doesn't get caught. But it was taking the chance that really mattered. His willingness to continue criminal activity despite the potential of severe consequences. This is really the problem with Jimmy's attitude, with his personality. He simply can't resist the call of his own personality, of his own tendencies, of his own antisocial desire. Jimmy believes that everybody is gullible and that everyone deserves to be tricked because of their own foolishness. So in a sense, he has a narcissistic position, or maybe a narcissistic fantasy, about getting ahead at the expense of other people. Jimmy sees himself as a non-violent predator. He uses his intellect, superior ability to scheme, and his charm to manipulate and steal from people. He can't recognize good opportunities even when they land right in his lap, like that job he had at the large, prestigious law firm. He couldn't handle being restricted. He couldn't follow their rules. That firm was looking for people who would be victims of a fraud perpetrated by a particular healthcare company. Jimmy produced and aired a commercial on television without getting permission from the firm. He couldn't handle being under somebody's authority. He needs to have his way. He believed that his way was right, and his way made sense. Therefore, that gave him the authority to disregard other people who had actually the legitimate authority in that situation. So he ranked his own desires and conclusions as more important than those of other people. This really brings to me the idea of narcissistic personality disorder, another cluster B personality disorder. Does Jimmy McGill qualify for this diagnosis as well, in addition to antisocial? I think he does have narcissistic tendencies, and I think he would actually qualify for a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, as well. I think he would meet the symptoms of grandiosity, fantasies of success and power, feeling special or unique, having a sense of entitlement, being manipulative, and lacking empathy. So I think he has those 6 criteria met. I don't see him as having the remaining symptom criteria, requiring excessive admiration, being envious, and being arrogant. So he has 6 out of 9, and only 5 are required for a diagnosis of NPD. Narcissism really plays a part in how Jimmy approaches how others feel about him. So he has feelings about others' attitudes towards him. This is really one of the themes of the show. He can't really accept how other people can't accept him. He feels judged continually, judged by his brother, judged by his brother's partner, Howard Hamlin, judged by Kim Wexler. Jimmy can't understand why people are bothered by his repeated criminal and unethical behavior. It never occurs to him that he's rejecting their point of view, their desire to be law-abiding and pro-social. Jimmy is self-centered. He's only out for himself. He lacks empathy or the desire to use empathy. He only sees things from his own perspective. His lack of insight keeps him trapped. His lack of insight is really why we see this rubber band effect, why he keeps going back to the same behavior. Now, the last theme that I want to touch on here is the Kim Wexler character and the interesting attitude that she seems to have toward Jimmy's behavior. In one sense, Kim Wexler is a rule follower. She became an attorney by following the system. She went to a legitimate school, she was ethical, and she does a good job. Even with all this, though, she is drawn to the manipulation and con artist strategies that Jimmy McGill uses. I think she struggles with the moral ramifications, but at the same time, she likes getting her way. She wants to succeed. She wants to be recognized. And Jimmy's style serves those purposes. She's drawn to doing whatever it takes, while simultaneously she backs away out of fear of the consequences of those behaviors. A few examples. We see that Kim and Jimmy are in a restaurant and they trick one of the customers into investing with them, right? It's not really investing. It was just a scheme they put together. They have the guy's check, and Kim Wexler wants to keep that check as a souvenir, but she won't cash it. So she was willing to manipulate him, but not necessarily to take his money. We see Kim enlist Jimmy's help to switch architectural drawings for one of her big customers, the bank Mesa Verde. She knows that if she's successful at this, the bank will be impressed with her. So this one she does follow all the way through, and the drawings are switched. We see Kim as representing a defendant in a criminal case, and this defendant won't accept a reasonable plea deal and is facing several years in jail. Jimmy proposes that he act like the prosecutor to trick the defendant into taking the plea deal. In theory, this is done with the defendant's best interest at heart. Kim tells Jimmy she can't go through with something like that, but then uses the fact that the defendant saw her have that conversation with Jimmy to promote that exact false narrative. Kim is successful. The defendant ends up taking the plea deal. In the beginning of season 5, we see that Kim tries to make up a sad story to convince a resident to vacate a property that her client needs. She fails in this effort as the resident sees right through her. She's unsuccessful at being Jimmy McGill. Kim is not a good con artist, but she's fascinated by the potential that that lifestyle holds. So there are my thoughts on Jimmy McGill and some of the other elements we see from Better Call Saul. It's intelligently written, and it kind of breaks from traditional character development. I think from a clinical perspective, one of the reasons it resonates so much is that in clinical practice, we see a lot of people who enter into these same patterns, right? They have a clear way to kind of set their life on the straight and narrow, and they choose to deviate from society's norms. Every time they do that, it feels like a failure from the counselor's point of view. Like we as counselors aren't doing a good job in convincing people what path to follow. But this just really reminds us that people have to make their own decisions. For a client, it's really about autonomy. Counselors are supposed to promote a client's autonomy. And sometimes clients make decisions that puzzle individuals who are counseling them, right? They don't seem to be in the best interest no matter how we define best interest. Now, this doesn't mean that counselors can't work to help clients kind of see what might be a good idea and what might not be, to appreciate the consequences of behavior. But it does mean that counselors can't force people to do anything. Clients come to counseling and we hope they get something useful from that, but ultimately clients have to make their own decisions. So when we look at somebody like Jimmy McGill and we see him make these mistakes repeatedly, it's important to recognize that those are the choices that he is making. Again, I know he's a fictional character, but we see a lot of people like this in real life, right? They're making decisions, and in the end, they have to accept the consequences of those decisions. I think the real tragedy of Jimmy McGill is he can't really see how others see him, right? He's stuck in that cycle. It's not so much what he does that's bad, it's that he can't break himself out of the pattern. I know whenever I talk about the mental health of fictional characters, there will be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.